So today we're going to talk about the Youth Criminal Justice Act, which sounds like it's sort of the regular criminal justice system trying to sound hip and nifty for the young folks. That's of course not what it is. The Youth Criminal Justice Act is the current legislatory regime by which the government deals with young people. That means people will see who are between the ages of 12 and 17 who have involved themselves with the criminal system. Another fancy way of saying that they've committed a crime. So the Youth Criminal Justice Act, you'll see, is actually meant to be an entirely different system. This picture here is Google Street View of a building that's not too far from Rosemont Metro. That I'm guessing most of you who are watching this have not seen this building in person because you've probably not been charged with a crime. But if you are charged with a crime, you don't go to the regular courthouse downtown, close to Place d'Armes Metro or Champ de Mars Metro. Instead, this is the building that is going to be dealing with your case. And this is a deliberate choice that they have a separate building. It's not just because they have such a high volume of cases. It's that the whole idea of the Youth Criminal Justice Act goes along with a long line of bits of legislation that have had this idea that youth need to be not just treated differently from adults in the criminal justice system, but they also need to be treated separately. We kind of don't want to blend them in with adult criminals. We don't think that's a good mix for them. It'll probably have a negative influence on them. But it's part of this whole idea that you need to treat children differently from adults in criminal matters. And before we get into exactly how that's done, there's a lot of questions that come up almost immediately as soon as you start talking to somebody about the Youth Criminal Justice Act in Canada, or generally how people are dealt with under the law. And there's a lot of misconceptions that are out there. Some people still have this idea, like you see this question here, I'm under 18. If I murder someone, do I go to jail? There's this idea like, well, as long as you're under 18, nothing really crazy happens to you. No, if you're under 18 and you murder someone, you do go to jail. And you say, well, yeah, but isn't it only like a maximum of 3 months or something like that? No, no, no. As long as you're over 14, you're probably going to get an adult sentence for murder, which means life sentence, no possibility of parole before 25 years. If you're under 14, they can't make that happen. But if you're over 14, and the overwhelming majority of murders aren't committed by young people, but those that are committed by young people tend to be people who are over 14, then you are going to get an adult sentence, most likely, for murdering someone. So then people come back and like, oh, but are you sure about that? I thought you could only go to jail for like 6 months. No, no, you can go to jail for longer than that. It just doesn't happen that often, again, because young people tend not to murder a lot, which is a good thing, I would say. So then the question becomes, okay, well, if you're just going to get an adult sentence for committing murder, if you're going to go to jail for life for committing murder, then what's the difference anyway? Well, it is true that if you're under 12 years of age and you murder someone, then the courts can't punish you. They can't even reprimand you. They can't give you even a fine for $5 and say, hey, we really don't like that you murdered there. That's because if you're under 12 years of age, then the system doesn't deal with you as a criminal at all. They deal with you. There are other means in place to try and address the problem, but they really see this as more a parenting issue. This is more a development issue than it is a criminal issue if you're under 12, right? If you're 12, they can still charge you with murder, but if you're 11 or 10 or 9 or 8, then they can't. So does that mean if some 11-year-old wanders into Metro with an assault rifle and then kills a whole bunch of people, they still can't put him in jail? And the answer is right. You could not even find him. And that's what freaks a lot of people out. They say, that sounds really, really strange. And a lot of people get really upset about that. They say, this is crazy that we don't have any means of dealing with 11-year-olds who kill 40 people. Well, on the one hand, maybe that is strange, but on the other hand, it's not. I just want to take a second to talk about what a moral panic is. A moral panic is this idea of, and it happens from time to time, like in the 1970s, there was a moral panic over role-playing games. This is kind of when Dungeons and Dragons first appeared on the scene. People said, "Well, this is crazy. It's a satanic cult that kids are starting." So, well, it's not exactly it. I mean, it may not have that much of a socially redeeming qualities to it, but It's very far from the awful satanic cult that some people were making it out to be. But people got very upset about it. People were saying, yeah, there's all these kids committing suicide because they think that when they play Dungeons and Dragons and they have a character who's able to fly, they get confused and they think they're able to fly. And they go and they jump off buildings thinking they'll fly. And, this kind of panic, a socially generated concern about something, is usually not based in much fact. Like in that case, there really weren't any cases of people jumping off of buildings. Moral panic, I have the definition here from Wikipedia. It's a feeling of fear spread among a large number of people that some evil threatens, and usually in a very big way, the well-being of society. When you were a kid, you might have been warned about a gray van that would pull up near the schoolyard, and some guy would open the door and offer you candy. And this is something that was certainly widespread when I was a kid. Other people either heard, well, it was a blue van or it was a white van. But this is a myth that actually tends to be pretty present in all around North America. And it's not that it absolutely never happens, that there's been some van where somebody was a child predator and using it. But the degree to which it became just a concern, 6 or 7 times a day, you should expect a van to pull up alongside you and try and convince you to get into the van. And where this becomes a problem is if policies and resources get poured into dealing with this problem when it doesn't really exist in a meaningful way. And that's kind of what happens sometimes with the Youth Criminal Justice Act and just generally youth criminal justice systems, that people get very concerned about problems like 11-year-olds who kill 40 people don't actually happen. We've never had an 11-year-old kill 40 people in Canada. We've had very, very, very few cases at all of anyone under 12 committing murder. There aren't 0 cases, but I looked it up a while ago and I don't have the exact numbers, so I invite you to do some research on it and you might find it interesting yourself. But I believe since 2000, there's perhaps been 2 murders committed by people under the age of 12. So that's about 20 years and 2 murders. And again, for a country with a population of, maybe 35 million, over 20 years, for that to be the only number of cases doesn't mean it's a huge social problem that needs to be addressed. So instead, the Youth Criminal Justice Act tries to, and we'll see to what degree it has any success in this, tries to deal with things that actually happen, with crimes that actually are committed by youth, without getting caught up in too much moral panic. So coming back to the original question, we sort of start out with, why would we need something like the Youth Criminal Justice Act? And that is because when you're dealing with kids, there are different stakes in addressing their criminal activity. Right? If we think of the purposes of sentencing that we've already talked about in the Canadian criminal justice system, we've seen that there are some that would be very applicable to kids and others less so. You'd say with kids, they're so young, rehabilitation is going to be a huge factor in how you would deal with sentencing, much more so than with, 35-year-old or 40-year-old criminals, at which point maybe they've kind of, they're more of a lost cause in terms of getting them to rehabilitate. But when they're young, rehabilitation has to be first and foremost. The measures that are going to be effective in dealing with their activity are going to be different than they would be for adults. So you're kind of going to expect that, a 14-year-old may have a little less cynicism than an adult will. And so we'll see that a lot of the sentencing options that exist for youth are ones that just don't exist for adults, in part because maybe they'd be inappropriate. Things like forcing the kid to apologize, forcing the kid to write an essay. You can also, under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, you can have kids being forced to perform sort of service for somebody they might have harmed. Like if they've vandalized a business, then the business might be given the opportunity by the judge, say, if I order this kid to work for you in cleaning up outside your store for a month to sort of undo the fact that he spray painted your window, is that something you'd be interested in? Again, that's not something that would make much sense for an adult, but for a kid, it certainly does. So, before we get any further, I already mentioned this, but it's important because you have to understand who this act addresses. A young person under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, a young person is somebody who, at the time that the offense is committed, is between 12 and 17 years old. Well, between 12 and 18 years old. As soon as you turn 18, you're no longer covered by the Youth Criminal Justice Act. And if you haven't turned 12 yet, when you commit the offense, you're not covered by the Youth Criminal Justice Act. So you're between 12 and 17. And notice this is at the time the offense is committed. If you commit an offense when you're 17 and a half years old, and it's still running in front of the judge, if it's still in court when you're 18 and a half or 19 even, you're still treated as a young person because it's at the time that the offense is committed. And you might be serving what they don't call it a prison sentence under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. They call it a custody and supervision order. But you can be in custody as a young person, effectively serving a jail sentence as a young person, even though you might be 20 years old at the time. There's complicated provisions for when they shift you into a provincial penitentiary, provincial prison or a federal penitentiary, but generally they try and avoid doing that. As long as it's reasonable, they'll have you serving out your sentence, even though you're no longer a young person. Now, the next point, and this is important if you're going to say to yourself, well, instead of getting caught up in moral panic and worrying about child murderers, and I don't mean people who murder children, but people who are children when they commit murders, you really want to say, okay, well, when we're dealing with youth justice, what kinds of crimes are we actually dealing with? And this is going to be important for shaping the legislation. What you'll see if you look at the statistics is that overwhelmingly, if you look down the different types here, overwhelmingly, the offenses that young people commit tend not to be violent ones, right? If these are the top 10 categories of offenses that young people commit, you'll see murder isn't up here at all. Theft is the most common one. That can be things like shoplifting. A lot of youth who get charged for something pretty minor. It could be shoplifting or stealing clothes from a store. So theft is... in contrast with robbery, which you see down at the bottom here, the 10th most popular one. In case you're not clear, robbery means there's some element of violence in taking something from someone, right? Like if you're taxing someone, if you're beating someone, taking their lunch money, that's robbery. Theft means there's no violence involved. You're just taking the thing and running off with it, right? The person's not present, or you're stealing from a store, which is most common. Theft is non-violent explicitly. That's what differentiates it from robbery. Common assault does show up as the second one, but keep in mind, common assault is different from major assault. Common assault means it's just straight Section 266 of the Criminal Code. It's not even a bruise, right? There's somebody gets punched or even like physically threatened still counts as assault under the Criminal Code. So it does come in as the second one, but it's a relatively mild form of assault. Third one, back to essentially theft, except you're breaking into somebody's house or into a business to get the thing. So again, it's a pretty close cousin to theft. And the fourth one, failure to comply with order, that's basically breaching probation, right? That's you're under a rule, usually because of a prior crime, and you're not able to stick to those rules. And the fifth one, again, is a property crime. Mischief is essentially vandalism. So if you're not sure what mischief means, that's what it does. So theft, break and enter, mischief, these are all property crimes. And they're number 1, 3, and 5 in terms of what you're likely to be charged with if you're a young person, and what the Youth Criminal Justice Act should be targeting in terms of dealing with.